If you want to know what life is really like inside an American prison, you have a choice. You can talk to a jailer and get the story from his perspective, or you can talk to an inmate and get the story from his. Or, as we reported last year, you can talk to Michael Marcum, who may know more about prisons than anyone else in this country. That's because he's been on both sides of the bars. His title is Assistant Sheriff for San Francisco County, number 3 man in the department, in charge of 5 jails, including this one, San Bruno, the oldest in the state of California. He is responsible for more than 2,000 inmates who've been charged with everything from misdemeanor drug possession to rape, robbery, and murder. And he commands a force of 600 sheriff's deputies, even though by law, as a convicted felon, he is prevented from taking the oath of a sworn law enforcement officer.
How much time did you spend in prison?
A little over 6 years.
Places like this?
Exactly like this.
He was a 19-year-old part-time college student when he was sent off to the Vacaville State Prison in California in 1966. Inmate B5427. Strange as it may seem, the man who runs San Francisco's jails is not only a convicted felon, but a convicted murderer.
I killed my father. Very long story, but...
To make a long story short, he shot his father following a heated argument, one of many he endured during years and years of physical and emotional abuse.
Did you think about it before you did it? No, it wasn't that kind of thing. But I knew what I was doing. It was my responsibility. I mean, I made the choice. What happened after you shot him? What did you do? I called the police. They took me to jail in Oakland. And that just began a whole other world for me.
It was a world of stone buildings and iron bars, a brutal, terrifying, and degrading experience. A private hell Marcum despised so much that he made changing it his personal calling. The big problem with prisons, he says, is that even today the people who run them aren't really in charge. In fact, he says, like most jails around the country, this one is run by the inmates.
They run the show back there.
What do you mean they run the show?
It's not our standards and our rules that people are following. It's their own standards, their own rules, which are based on the absolute worst understanding of human nature and expectations about humans.
Such as?
Such as that the toughest person is going to get over. The most violent, the craziest, the person quickest across the line, the strongest, the person with the largest clique, the person with the best weapons, that kind of thing. That's who's going to set the standards inside the tier.
How does a convicted murderer end up running a prison system? It's not something you can explain in a sentence. It was an evolution that took years. But it began the very first day at Vacaville when he and other brand new prisoners were marched naked into a shower to the hoots and catcalls of the convicts who were watching.
What do you remember about your first day in prison? The tension, the violence in the air, other people sizing us up as we came in, deciding who was going to get who was going to be weak, who was going to be strong. And I was terrified, absolutely terrified, doing my absolute best to look tough. Did it make any difference that you were in there for murder? To some extent, because people knew that I'd crossed an extreme social, cultural taboo by taking a life. There was a sense that they had to take you seriously. Yeah. And that you had killed someone already. And unfortunately, there's some reverse honor inside prison, depending on how horrendous your offense is. You're in on a petty with a prior, petty theft or a burglary. It's not particularly respectable. You've killed somebody, you've committed an armed robbery with a gun. There's some respect for that, basic respect for that. It's just an upside-down society with upside-down values.
Initially, he thought he could rely on the prison guards for help. He viewed them as potential friends, law enforcement professionals who would protect him. But he quickly learned that they, too, had bought into this strange prison culture. Every day, as soon as the guards locked them down, the prisoners were responsible for their own survival.
Violence permeated everything. I mean, day in and day out. Everything you did, you kind of looked at in the context of, could this get me killed? Could this get me raped? Could this get somebody else killed? Did you have a weapon? Various times. In my career inside, I had weapons. Yeah. Did you ever use them? once or twice. Not something, and it's important for me to say this, not something I'm proud of. And particularly in light of what happened with my father and I. The last thing I wanted anything to do with was ever hurting another human being. But it became clear to me after a while inside that if I didn't show that I was capable of defending myself, that I was going to end up a victim very shortly.
To survive, he learned how to make armor by stuffing magazines in his clothes, and how to command respect from other inmates by challenging the system.
What kind of a prisoner were you?
Pain in the ass. The kind of prisoner that I definitely wouldn't want in any of my jails. Like, I was probably a handful.
You were an organizer.
Yeah.
Troublemaker.
Yeah, an organizer. Troublemaker for staff, but an organizer.
He was an organizer back in the late 1960s and early 70s during the heyday of the prison reform movement. He organized food strikes, yard strikes, and other acts of passive resistance. He co-founded the United Prisoners Union and filed a lawsuit that eventually overturned California's law barring felons from voting.
I could not accept that something this cancerous, ugly, and dishonest could exist in the middle of our society. It was like a monster factory, you know, people literally getting worse and worse and worse, more and more and more violent, and then going back out onto the streets. And we were calling it rehabilitation at the time.
So essentially you made your mark by going after the man.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And now you are the man.
Yeah. And that was a difficult transition for me.
That transition began just hours after he was paroled, when the joys of freedom turned into sheer panic. He took an apartment in the Mission District of San Francisco, but quickly found himself unable to function on the outside.
I had a role inside prison. I was somebody. People respected me. Staff respected me, or at least were somewhat fearful of me. Other prisoners respected me. I had some dignity. I knew how to function. I knew the rules. I get out and I'm absolutely nobody. Nobody. With no job skills, I was scared to death of women. I was scared every time I saw a policeman, I was like getting ready to get patted down or shook down. Just a cop on the beat walking the street, I was sure he knew who I was.
He thought about committing another crime just so he could return to prison. But his parole officer understood what he was going through and helped him get a job as, of all things, a rehabilitation counselor at San Francisco County Jail.
The minute I walked in, even though it was horrendous in terms of the fear of those steel doors clanging behind you, on the other hand, I was on my turf again. You know, this is the world I know.
He did so well, he kept getting promoted up the ranks, culminating with his appointment in 1993 as assistant sheriff. Sheriff Michael Hennessy is the person who hired him.
You could have picked anybody in the country to run this jail, chosen from thousands of people. Why did you pick Michael Marcum?
Well, I'd worked with him for close to 20 years, so I knew him very well. I knew his approach was a very good and responsible one, and the very fact that the person in charge of the jail is an ex-offender, I think sends a message to the people in our jails that society does want to give them a chance to change their lives.
But not everyone in the jails felt that way, especially the guards.
One deputy told us, and let me quote, "It's repugnant, not to mention ironic, that someone who by law is excluded from taking the oath of office to be a sheriff's deputy is in charge of 600 of them."
Well, you know, some of the most important people in the world spent time in prison. You can look at Mahatma Gandhi, you can look at Nelson Mandela, you can look at Malcolm X, you can look at Martin Luther King. They all spent time in jail.
Marcum is the last person who would put himself in that company. He is apolitical and keeps very much to himself. All he cares about are prisons and changing them. So what does Marcum's ideal jail look like? Well, this is it. He helped design it, and it's very different from the traditional jail. There are no heavy metal doors or bars separating the inmates from the guards. But that's not the only difference.
The difference is the way we manage this facility. The staff person that you met who's standing right there is in here at all times. This area is never turned over to prisoners. We control the area night and day, 24 hours a day. There isn't one moment where jail culture can flourish. Predators can't rise to the occasion and take control.
No clubbings, stabbings, or rapes. No assaults on staff. Except for an occasional fistfight, this jail has none of the problems that plague the other jails where the inmates make the rules on their side of the bars. But the jail's dormitory setting, with all of its telephones, televisions, game boards, and other amenities, have led some to call it the glamour slammer and to complain that prisoners here are being coddled.
I think a lot of people say, you know, the jail ought to be as Spartan, as unpleasant as possible.
And I agree. Spartan, but somehow consistent with the values of our culture and our society. It's real easy to just say, give us more money for more jails and more prisons, when all of us know it's a hoax. Every one of us in this business knows that whether people have done 20 years or 1 year, we're dumping everybody right back into your neighborhood and my neighborhood.
Marcum says a jail like this actually costs a lot less, about a third less to build, than a traditional jail with bars and individual cells. And anyone who thinks it coddles convicts, well, they haven't talked to the inmates.
What do you guys think of this place?
Concentration camp.
There may be no iron bars in this jail, but there are rules, lots of rules. Inmates are required to attend class up to 12 hours a day, as well as undergo drug and alcohol counseling. Yelling is forbidden, so is profanity and making racist remarks. Prisoners aren't allowed to put their feet on prison furniture or to watch television without permission. And they're also told when to wake up, when to go to bed, when to wash, even when to be quiet.
Quiet time. That's quiet time. How we gotta sit here? Yeah. Can I use the bathroom? I'm older than half the deputies.
Then after a while, after you keep hearing it, you be like, F it, man, send me back to the other jail. Because you get tired of just them being on your back.
I'm glad they hate it. It's a time to impose some self-discipline. You're going to clean up the pod. Now you're going to be quiet for a while because you're going to have to do that out in real life. Whether you're in a library or in a job or in school, you're going to have to get used to those kinds of structures and disciplines. It's part of surviving out there, and that's why we do it.
You think the glamour slammer is tougher on the inmates than what we saw at San Bruno, jail number 3, the traditional system?
Absolutely. We take away the glory, the glamour of being a convict in a tough joint. I mean, we start calling them by name. When we start saying, you don't have a high school diploma, you've got to get one. You don't know how to read, you're going to learn how to read. You've been beating your wife. What do you think this means to your kids that you keep talking about? People lose that whole convict persona and become vulnerable people who are ready for some sort of help.
How many Michael Marcums are there, do you think, in the glamour slammer right now?
The place is full of Michael Marcums. And in some ways, I'm my own role model. And I think a lot of the prisoners know that too. And I think it's important for public safety and for those prisoners that they see me and know it can be done.
And Marcum's approach seems to be working. A recent study conducted by the University of California at San Francisco shows that inmates who were paroled from Marcum's glamour slammer are 20% less likely to get rearrested than those paroled from other prisons. Another set of Marcum alumni are doing even better. They were given a job, housing assistance, and in some cases, drug and alcohol treatment upon their release. And 2 years later, almost all of them, 85%, remain free and, as far as anyone can tell, law-abiding citizens.